And we're back, like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Wednesday morning with me here in New York. Once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. So you notice I was not quite as spirited in my opening today as I normally would be. It is the 23rd anniversary of one of the darkest days in the history of the United States. Most people, regardless of where you are in the ideological spectrum, most people would agree with that general point. For those of you who are too young to have any real memories of it, or are so young that you weren't even alive, it is very difficult. You can see the horrifying images in the video and listen to first-person accounts and even secondhand accounts, and you can get an idea. You can get an idea of it. You can feel it. You can sympathize. You can empathize. You can understand intellectually. But it's the same kind of thing that people who served, people who were overseas when Pearl Harbor happened, it's different. It just feels different when you live through it. Heaven forbid you lost people, family members, loved ones. And I was fortunate in that I did not lose a loved one, but I knew people who did. And my father worked with a number of people who perished. And it still sometimes feels surreal. And it's hard for me to even imagine this all really happened, but it did. And every cliche, there are certain historical events where people throw cliches and we say, well, that's maybe overstating it, but in this instance, it's not. People say the day the world changed, it did. And not only the world changed, but a lot of our processes changed. A lot of things that we perhaps hadn't really pondered before. Suddenly, we had to. We did. You start asking questions that, do I really want to go into a building that high again? I mean, I was afraid of heights to begin with. When I was a kid, I went to the top of the Empire State Building. My parents and I and my sister, we stayed 90 stories up in the Trade Center and the hotel they had there. You start processing data differently. It was that all-encompassing a level of devastation. Felt it on a cellular level, even if you didn't lose anyone, even if it was just horrifying images at that point. And what I remember about that day, now I was long out of college by this point. I had graduated more than 4 years prior from New York University, Lower Manhattan. But I was scheduled to be in the city that evening. A friend of mine, a fellow writer, had written a book, and he adapted the book into a screenplay. And he needed feedback, so he had set up a theater. I don't know exactly how it worked out, but there was a theater. There was going to be what amounts to what they would call in the business a table read. And I was not involved in the table read. I was simply going to be one of 30 or 40 people in attendance for this table read. So that was going to be my day. I went to the gym. I had my normal morning. And on the way back from the gym, I stopped at King Cullen on Jericho Turnpike in Huntington. And I don't remember what I bought, but I remember vividly. Number one, it was a really nice day. It was I believe, low 80s and no humidity. Maybe it was high 70s at that point, but it was still before 9 a.m. And I remember the cashier, as I was checking out, she looked out the window and said, "Man, it's a beautiful day." Yeah, actually, it was. And so when I got home, I didn't have a cell phone. There was really no social media. The internet existed, so information was traveling quicker, but it's nothing like now, where one person knows something and in less than a minute, thousands of people know something. It's still, in some ways, traveled a little bit slower. So when I got home, I did something I had done how many thousands of times in my life already to that point, 23 years ago, I turned on the TV in the living room. I was going to make myself breakfast or whatever, and I was just going to check out what's going on. And when I turned the TV on, there was an image of the Trade Center, one of the towers, on fire. There are moments where our brains, our eyes, we know what we see, we understand what we're looking at, but it's still a syntax error because there is a part of us that rejects it and says, this can't be right. This is not correct. And I stared at that. And then the announcers were saying something about, we think that a plane hit it. We're still trying to get confirmation. We don't really know. And I'm not sure how many minutes after this I had turned the TV on. But I was in shock like everyone else. And I wasn't thinking of my father at that moment. My dad, he worked in Midtown. It turned out that he was closer to it than I thought because he had a dentist appointment in Lower Manhattan. But just looking at that, I could not process it. It just didn't compute. So I turned the TV off, and I took a couple of minutes. My heart started to beat faster. I was almost having an anxiety attack because this was so far removed than anything you could have ever imagined on a normal morning in September. And so I turned the radio on and I put it on to WFAN, and it was Don Imus's program. And he had Warner Wolf, the sportscaster, on with him. And normally they just were yucking it up. They used to make fun of Warner, and he used to do, let's go to the videos. He used to do his shtick. He was a clown, and he knew a lot about sports, but he was always a funny guy. They used to have laughs. But in this instance, they were talking to Warner because his apartment was close. It was, a number of blocks away. And I think that he, on the air, he wasn't the first person to report it, but he was the first person that Don Imus and that crew and people such as myself listening, he said, the second building is on fire too now. I don't know what just happened. And so I didn't turn the TV back on. I just listened to this radio broadcast. And then Warner Wolf said, the first building's gone. It's gone. And then you start to hear the phrase terror attack. And there was no, I was numb. I was in such shock. I still couldn't believe that this was real. How is this possible? How can this happen? Well, it was possible. It did happen. It was in process. It was continuing to happen. We didn't realize what was going on with the Pentagon and Flight 93, which I assume was going to hit somewhere else in Washington, maybe the Capitol building. Who knows what the plan was there? But all of this horrendous horror taking place in real time. And honestly, when I saw the building burning, I wasn't thinking everyone in that building or everyone above a certain floor is going to die. I didn't think that because I was never trained to think that. It's not something that would have been the first time. For some people it was, but it felt like it was happening in slow motion. Now, if I had known that my father was in Lower Manhattan, that he was near Washington Square Park, as a matter of fact, his dentist, Dr. Brisman, at the time, his office was just off of the park. It was across the street, in fact. And my dad's recollection of it, because I didn't see my dad that day, he ended up staying in the city at my aunt's apartment. She lived in, I think she lived on 81st Street, East 81st Street at the time in East End Avenue. But Dad told me that he was on the subway going down to see the dentist. And nobody had a cell phone that he remembered, but somebody was listening to a transistor, like a small radio, and said, they say that a single engine plane hit one of the towers. They're trying to figure out what happened, or words to that effect. And no one else on the train updated that information at the time. And I guess the second hit hadn't taken place yet. Dad's memory of it was that even in that moment, well, that doesn't make any sense. How's that even possible? Don't they have rules prohibiting planes from, like there's no fly zones? You can't just fly a plane in Midtown Manhattan. If you had a helicopter that wasn't clear, they might shoot you down. So his version of the story, and this is the only thing that he ever told me about this, he said when he came up the subway drop, he got to the top step, and everybody who was in his vicinity, they could see the first tower go down. And you say to yourself then, well, what are you supposed to do? Like they weren't near the blast radius. They weren't running away from anything, but what do? Do you just go to your dental appointment? Do you just go to the office? Do you just try to get home? I feel like by that point, the major railroads, they had shut them down. And I don't know if the city, they didn't exactly declare martial law, but the people walking across the Brooklyn Bridge, that's something that really happened. So my dad, I didn't see him until the following day. And I didn't ask him to give me blow by blow or a greater description of what he saw. He didn't need to. He explained enough. And in a similar vein, I remember asking my uncle, who had been wounded in World War II. I was a small boy. I was a little kid. I was about 6. I wasn't looking to, start any trouble. But I asked him what it was like, and he just didn't want to talk about it. As quiet as he could, because he didn't want to scare me or upset me. I was so young, but he didn't want to talk about it. And I understood why. And I just didn't ask my father what he saw, because why? I can only imagine how horrible. It's not going to give me a greater understanding of the event. So we never talked about it, never, prodded him further or anything. But if I had known that he was going to be in Lower Manhattan, I would have probably freaked out. I would have been as panicky as anybody else, just praying that nothing happened. And he wouldn't have been in either of those buildings. But we saw horrible, unbelievably terrifying footage of people running away from the smoke and the dust and flame and falling debris. It's beyond imagination. And so the table read of my friend's script was canceled, not surprisingly. And he didn't reschedule it at the time. But it was something that I was thinking about. Nobody was going to be, I shouldn't say nobody. Most people were not going to be going into the city that day unless they absolutely had to. And that's something the city has done in weather emergencies where sometimes they kind of seal it off, say, no. Nobody can come in who doesn't belong here, who doesn't live here. The city is closed. I think that was the quote, the blizzard of 96. I think that was the quote that Giuliani used. And he wasn't trying to be funny. It wasn't a laugh line or anything like that. And I think he just said the city is closed. And I don't know if he said that here. I don't think that he said that in this instance, but there wasn't any reason to go to the city if you didn't live there. Or, heaven forbid, if you were trying to find a loved one, somebody close to you. You would go through any hell to try to find them unharmed, alive. So I've always wondered if this had happened, because I remember I was in the city when the 1993, the first attempt to take down the Trade Center happened. And that story also, the way that it was reported at first, it didn't seem like that big of a deal. I was only 19, but not that it didn't seem like that big of a deal. By the time we found out about it, the disaster had been contained. And I didn't spend that much time, because if you just out of context, you say to yourself, okay, this guy drove a truck with an unbelievable amount of explosives into a garage. And the intention was they were going to detonate it in such a way that the whole building was going to come down. But by the time it was reported, that it didn't work. So I didn't dwell on the fact that it didn't work because the sense was sigh of relief. But unfortunately, we better be prepared for something like this to happen again. But that's the thing. You just don't know. I mean, I can remember the first Gulf War, more than 33 and a half years ago. I was in 11th grade, and I can remember not just teachers, not just people on TV, but national security officials, and not so much president, that was the first President Bush, but there was an idea, they were saying stuff like, be vigilant. And then they would say, there's nothing to stop somebody from getting into a subway and just opening fire or setting off a bomb. And these are things that when you're a kid, you understand that maybe they exist, but you don't want to think about it, especially if you're already a really nervous and easy to become shaken up individual. So I remember the fears in 91, and then the sigh of relief that 93 was that Ramzi Youssef was the ringleader of that one, that it wasn't as bad as it could have been. It wasn't even close to being as bad as it could have been. They wanted a total destruction, and it didn't happen. But 9/11 is such a horrendous day, and it's still difficult to even conceive of. And it all happened, and I've seen the movies. I watched United 93, which was, I mean, it felt like a documentary because they used a lot of the real people that were at mission control and air traffic controllers and people who work for the FAA. That was a really good movie, but really depressing and horrible because of just the self-contained situation of Flight 93. Even that's a tragedy. Yes, there is triumph because they probably saved who knows how many lives. People died. It's not that it's a Pyrrhic victory, but it's not really a win. That was such a depressing movie. And the Oliver Stone film with Nicolas Cage, World Trade Center, even though there are moments of uplift, it's also just brutal. And I feel like it is important for younger people to understand. You can't really ever put yourself into the shoes of somebody who lost a family member or had a family member who was gravely injured in this, or just having lived through the incredible fear and uncertainty and not understanding, how is this even possible? How can this happen? And now what? 23 years later, I'm still scratching my head in disbelief. But I will never forget. How can you? It's a part of the fabric of the city. You even saw the baseball teams, the kind of the rivalry with the Mets and Yankees, but both the Mets and Yankees pitching in, the teams doing their best to raise money. And it was a legitimate question. Joe Torre and Bobby Valentine, who was the Mets manager, and even George W. Bush, who was president. Remember, George W. Bush had the baseball connection. He had been the owner of the Texas Rangers. And it was a legitimate question, when do we restart the baseball season? And should we even be playing baseball? Like, what are we doing here? And Joe Torre always said, we serve as a distraction, that hopefully give people a little bit of entertainment. You can't really make them forget their troubles, but that's how he saw it. There was an idea, though. There were some people saying they should just cancel the season. But you go all the way back to 63, when Kennedy was assassinated. The NFL played football that weekend, and that was something that Pete Rozelle, he took a lot of criticism for the rest of his life. That was probably a mistake. They should have had a week. Because there were even then people who were saying, do we just stop the season? What do we do? Do we take a month off and then just start the playoffs? What do we do? Because if something hasn't happened before, you're making up rules as you go along. And I remember when the baseball season restarted, and that was the year Barry Bonds ended up breaking the home run record, which, if we want to be fair, was already a tainted record. McGwire and Sosa smashing Roger Maris, but Bonds was going for the record, and he ended up just beating it out of sight, beating it by 3. But the season was delayed, and then it picked up. And like I said, the Mets and Yankees, they chipped in. They did a lot of. They both went the extra mile, both organizations. And I understand George Steinbrenner had a ton of money. I get that, but they still went the extra mile. Just because people have the resources and have a ton of money, it doesn't mean that they're going to be charitable. So I'm not one of those people who automatically poo-poos every contribution by somebody who was as loaded as George. I felt like the Mets and Yanks, the players, they really tried to help. Going to food drives and donating from their own pocket. Everyone just tried to equip themselves as well as they could. Now, from the sports perspective, the Yankees had won 4 of the 5 previous World Series. After having not won since 1978, they won the World Series in 96, 98, 99, and 2000. The 2001 Yankees, they weren't that good. But then again, the 2000 Yankees sucked, and it was miraculous that they ended up winning a World Series. They're one of the worst World Series winning teams ever. But 2001, they won the division, got into the postseason, and they made it to the World Series. They didn't end up winning, but the way the World Series played out, in a lot of ways, was kind of how it had to, because the city was still hurting so badly, and it took, I don't even know how many weeks before Ground Zero stopped smoking. God, like that's something that I wouldn't have ever thought about. But the Yankees got blown out of the first 2 games in Arizona, and they came home to the stadium, and they won all 3. They won all 3 games in the Bronx, and games 4 and 5 were both just absurd, spectacular 9th inning, 2-out home run victories. And again, cliche city, but it felt like the city was rising already. That, for better or worse, the Yankees were representing the best of New York. That they were down repeatedly, but not out. So they ended up winning those 3, and they went to Arizona needing to win one of the final 2 to win what would have been their 5th World Series in 5 years. Game 6 was a catastrophe. They got crushed. And in Game 7, they had a late lead, but Mariano Rivera, the Yankee bullpen, had not been as good that year as previous years, and Rivera now had to pitch 2 innings. And in the 8th, he was dominant, but in the 9th, he just didn't have it. There were a couple of bad plays on defense, and the Yankees ended up losing that game and that World Series. They were outplayed, though. I mean, the Diamondbacks mostly beat the brakes off of them, and the Yanks got exceedingly lucky. But there is something to be said, unfortunately, for the idea that there was a bittersweet aspect to that World Series. Even if the Yankees had won, what have you really won? You already have 26 World Series championships. The horror already is over and done with. We can't do anything about it. So the fact that they won, and there wasn't even a muted celebration, historically speaking, it feels fitting, because it was not in any way a time for celebration. I mean, I could say in the country, but I wouldn't criticize anyone in Arizona. They got excited. I mean, I don't mean it that way. But historically, it's fitting that they didn't win that World Series. I'm okay with it because it's small fry. It's way small fry compared to the horror that everyone experienced on September 11th, 2001. This has been episode 299 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Wednesday morning with me here in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, iTunes, Spotify, or any of the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, peace.